The darkest day in Portuguese football history. A day marked by violence, chaos, and irreversible consequences. A day that saw masked men storm a training ground, players and staff physically assaulted, arrests made, and the president of one of Portugal's biggest clubs ultimately overthrown. In the aftermath, over €100 million worth of talent terminated their contracts overnight, walking away from Sporting and leaving the club in a crisis. But make no mistake, this wasn't a random act of madness in a sunny day in May 2018. This was the explosive climax to nearly a year of growing tension and public infighting. The fractures between Sporting's ultras, the players, and President Bruno de Carvalho had deepened into open warfare. Fans were furious, the president increasingly erratic, and the dressing room completely fractured. Everyone was at war with everyone. What happened at Alcochete wasn't just an attack. It was a symptom of football club tearing itself apart from the inside. And while the events that day were shocking, the lead up was just as disturbing. This story has a lot of moving parts and a lot of different characters, which is riddled in conspiracies still to this day. In this video, I'll be breaking down the darkest day in Portuguese football and sporting history, the Alcochete Academy attacks. But also, this story is one of redefiance, where a club doctor would eventually save a club and would make Sporting into eventual 3-time champions. But that is covered in another video, which is located on screen and in the link in the description, along with the rest of my timeline videos. So where does this story begin? Bruno de Carvalho was born in 1972 in Mozambique, just before the country gained independence from Portugal. His family moved to Lisbon when he was nearly 4, and he grew up studying management and sports. He was deeply connected to Sporting from a young age. He joined the Juvenile Ultras at 13. Bruno de Carvalho would go on to earn degrees in management and sports management, launching several businesses in construction, and also found a non-profit organisation that helped over 1,200 at-risk youth through sport. Between 2009 and 2011, he also served as vice president of Sporting's roller hockey department, quietly building his own path into Sporting. On March 27, 2011, Bruno de Carvalho first emerged as a serious contender for the presidency of Sporting. Backed by way of popular support, he won the popular vote by over 15,000 members, but ultimately lost the election by just 360 votes to Gordinho Lopes due to the club's weighted voted system. Sporting, like many other football clubs in Portugal, uses a weighted voting system in its internal elections. Here's how it works in simple terms. In this system, the number of votes a member has, or a paying socio at least, is not equal for everyone. It depends on how long they've been a member at the club. For an example, a member of 1 to 4 years might get 1 vote. A member of 5 to 9 years might get 4 votes. A member for 10 plus years might get 10 plus votes, and so on and so on. The longer your loyalty, the more voting power you have. But this result sparked outrage. Tensions ran so high that the winner, Gordinho Lopes, couldn't even address the crowd of frustrated supporters who had gathered outside. Instead, it was Bruno de Carvalho himself who stepped in to calm them down. Bruno de Carvalho did not walk away quietly, however. He publicly contested the results, alleging irregularities in the voting process and demanded a recount. His requests were denied by the club's General Assembly president at the time, Bruno de Carvalho, leaving many fans suspicious about the transparency of the election. This early controversy was just the beginning. It set the tone for what would become the most turbulent and polarising presidential elections in Sporting history. So how did Gordinho Lopes do at Sporting? Did he turn the club around in the face of its doubters? Well, no. Sporting spiralled into a chaos under President Gordinho Lopes. Poor results had led to the sacking of coach Domingos Paciencia, with Sapinto steadying the ship before another collapse following a cup final loss to Académica de Coimbra. One dismissal followed another. Sapinto left, top executives Luis Duque and Carlos Freitas left, and eventually Gordinho Lopes took over football operations himself. After another failed stint with Belgian manager Frank Verkhouten, Lopez brought in Gesualdo Ferreira as a manager of managers. But the team continued to sink, sitting just 1 point above relegation by early 2013. Verkhouten was sacked, and Gesualdo Ferreira took full control, and behind the scenes, pressure mounted. It is considered to be one of the worst seasons ever in Sporting's history. The club ended in 7th place in the league table, the lowest position in the club's history, thus failing to qualify for the following season's Champions League or even Europa League. Sporting were also eliminated from Europa League that season for the first time ever in the group stage, ending up in 4th place, including losing 3-0 to a team called Video Town. Facing a revolt from club members and demanding new elections, Lopez and his board finally resigned in February 2013. In his final days, he clashed with the club's General Assembly and controversially sold Ricky van Wolfswinkel to Norwich, and was widely criticised by his successors. Many fans would go on to label him the worst president in Sporting history. Not only did he ruin the club results-wise, but financially, the club was in ruins. And who would win the next elections? You guessed it. The man who felt he was wrongfully robbed of the last one, Bruno de Carvalho. And Bruno de Carvalho found success almost immediately after taking charge. Financially, he pulled Sporting back from the brink of bankruptcy. Within his first month, he negotiated a debt restructuring plan with the club's main banking partners. Over the following years, he reduced liabilities, controlled payroll costs, and stabilised the club's finances. He immediately replaced Gesualdo Ferreira with Leonardo Jardim, who wasted no time promoting academy talents like Carlos Mané and future captains William Carvalho and Adrian Silva straight into the first team. Bruno de Carvalho also made smart moves in the transfer market. Fredy Montero arrived from Seattle on loan, and Islam Slimani was signed for just €300,000. However, almost instantly, he clashed with agents of rising stars such as Bruma and Thiago Ilori. Especially in the case of Bruma, where Bruma's agent claimed his contract had expired, but Sporting insisted it was valid until 2014. A legal battle was pursued where Sporting were found correct, as Bruma was still under contract until 2014. Part of this though, Bruma's agent accused then President Bruno de Carvalho of sending Sporting ultras, specifically Uvaleo, to coerce Bruma into signing a new deal, allegedly attempting to kidnap him outside a hotel. But he ultimately sold them. Bruma was sold to Galatasaray for €13 million, and Thiago Ilori was sold to Liverpool for €7.5 million. He also cleaned out high earners who haven't delivered, including Stein Charles, Fabian Rinaldo, and Gelson Fernandez, bringing just over €2 million. But what was different to Bruno de Carvalho is that, unlike other presidents, he would not sit in a presidential suite. He would not watch the games with the higher-ups. He would actually sit on Sporting's bench. He'd be joined, of course, by the manager and the substitutes, but he wanted to be amongst it all. Bruno's and Jardim's first season was a success. Sporting finished second in the league, losing only 3 matches and finishing just 6 points behind George Jesus' Benfica, a dramatic turnaround in Bruno's first full season. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The next major turning point came when Monaco activated Leonardo Jardim's release clause. Once again, Bruno de Carvalho made a bold and calculated move, hiring 36-year-old Marco Silva from Estoril. Marco Silva continued the youth first philosophy, integrating talents like João Mario, Tobias Figueiredo and Ricardo Esgaio into the senior squad. The 2014-15 wasn't big in terms of spending. Bruno de Carvalho made quiet but smart signings. Paulo Oliveira came in for Victoria Guimarães for €1.8 million. Fredy Montero loaned and was made permanent for €1.14 million, but the blockbuster move came in the form of a loan deal for Nani. A true homecoming. At only 27 years old at the time, Nani returned from Manchester United as a part of a deal that saw Marcos Rojo go the other way, but also €20 million going in Sporting's pocket, with United also covering most of Nani's wages. It remains one of the best deals in Sporting's modern history. On the exit front, it included Elias, Sporting's former record signing at €8 million, sold to Corinthians for just €4 million, and Eric Dyer also left for England, joining Tottenham Hotspur for €5 million. Sporting would regress in terms of league form, finishing third, but they actually got 9 more points than the season before with 76, only losing 2 games but drawing 10, getting 76 points as Porto and Benfica finished ahead of them, 6 and 9 points respectively. However, Bruno de Carvalho would show a bit of fire early on. He lambasted the players in a Facebook post after a 3-0 defeat to Vitória Guimarães. The angry backlash to this from the fans, the board and the players, Bruno de Carvalho would say that he'd take a step back from Facebook and would not post on the site anymore. Silva would be successful on other fronts though, winning the Taça de Portugal, which is the Portuguese equivalent of the FA Cup. They beat Braga on penalties, despite being down to 10 men from the 14th minute. In the Champions League, Sporting also played very well, having 2 great performances against Jose Mourinho's Chelsea, but they also beat Schalke and Maribor, but missed out on the round of 16 by just 1 point from Schalke. But Sporting were robbed against Schalke, where Jonathan Silva was called for a handball in the 93rd minute when it clearly hit his head. Bruno de Carvalho filed a formal complaint with UEFA, who dismissed it. Sporting would drop into the Europa League that season, where they were dismantled by a young Kevin De Bruyne and Bas Dost against Wolfsburg. So with a young manager and the finances improving, with academy players being promoted and even getting called up to the Portuguese national team, surely the bond between Bruno de Carvalho and Marco Silva would grow in the future seasons. Surely they would establish a new dynasty in Portugal, or was something else going to happen? One thing that even to this day you can't say about Bruno de Carvalho is that he wasn't ambitious. He wanted Sporting back on the big stage, and he wasn't shy about trying to take down their biggest rivals, mostly Benfica. Bruno de Carvalho frequently clashed with Benfica and Benfica's president at the time, Luis Felipe Vieira. Their feud was very fiery and very public, which had Bruno de Carvalho accusing Benfica of corruption, including providing jerseys of Eusebio to match officials before and after games. He also took shots through open letters, public occasions and of course through social media. He famously dubbed Benfica Estado Lampianico, which translates roughly to the Lampion state, implying that they had an unfair grip on the media, referees and even political influence. Bruno alleged that Benfica were protected by officials and the league, often stirring up match-fixing conspiracy theories, especially during tense title races. He was fined multiple times for these accusations, but that never stopped him. The Portuguese phrase colinho, which is translated to coddling or babying, went viral among Sporting fans, mocking the idea that Benfica were being gently carried to victories by referees. Bruno's rivalry with Benfica went so deep that he actually hated the colour red and banned it from Sporting. The colour red was banned from club branding, presentations and even sponsor graphics. He also allegedly banned Alan Ruiz, a Sporting player in 2017 and 18, from parking his red Ferrari at the players' car park. This wasn't just about football for Bruno. This was a personal rivalry, something that he had to grow up with, supporting Sporting and even as leader of Sporting. It was a culture war and he made sure everyone knew it. But perhaps the biggest blow Bruno de Carvalho ever dealt Benfica was in the 2014-15 off-season. As mentioned previously, Marco Silva had done a successful job with Sporting, winning the Taça de Portugal. But out of nowhere, in the off-season, Marco Silva was sacked. The official reason is that Sporting cited just cause, pointing to Silva's refusal to wear the club suit in the December 2014 game. Yes, really, that was the technical justification. But behind the scenes, this was clearly a political and chess move, not a fashion dispute. This loophole allowed them to terminate his contract without compensation, a move that many saw as a legal technicality rather than a genuine offence. The real reason, of course, is that Bruno de Carvalho had bigger plans, ones that did not include Marco Silva. He wanted to make a statement, and he did that by poaching Benfica's crown jewel, Jorge Jesus, the most successful Benfica manager of the 21st century. The man who led Benfica to 3 Premier League titles, 5 Taça da Liga trophies, 1 Taça de Portugal and 2 Europa League finals. Despite losing them both, Benfica still excelled on the European stage. A total of 10 major trophies and also legendary status for Jorge Jesus at Benfica. But he had a contract dispute with Luis Felipe Vieira and they decided not to renew his contract. This is where Sporting swooped in. By bringing Jorge Jesus to the Alvalade, Bruno didn't just fire a coach, He snatched a serial winner from Benfica's heart, flipped the power dynamic and sent shockwaves through Portuguese football. The new manager at the helm, Bruno de Carvalho, opened the checkbook. He brought in the likes of Telefio Gutierrez, Naldo, Sebastian Coates, and arguably the standout signing of the window, Brian Ruiz. Future Sporting manager João Pereira also returned to the club during this period. Remarkably, all these signings just cost around €9 million. Jorge Jesus also promoted several players from the B team, including Ruben Semedo, Mateus Pereira and Gelson Martins. On the other end, Sporting cashed in on a few assets. Cedric Soares left for Southampton, Fredy Montero went to China, and players like Mauricio, Naby Sarr and fan favourite Diogo Capel were sold, bringing in about €19 million in player sales. Some argue that the 15-16 team is one of Sporting's greatest ever teams assembled. A solid midfield and forwards, the only thing you could argue that was lacking was the defence. But still, you had Portuguese international Rui Patricio in goal, you still had the great midfield pivot of Adrian Silva and William Carvalho, and the wingers of Brian Ruiz, Andre Carrillo and of course up top Islam Slimani was a recipe for success. The investment immediately showed results. Sporting beat Benfica 1-0 in the Supertaça, the Portuguese Super Cup, with Teo Gutierrez, the new signing, scoring the only goal. It was Bruno's second trophy as president and Jorge Jesus' first at Sporting. However, it wasn't all cause of celebration. Just a few days later, Sporting would have to face CSKA Moscow in the Champions League playoffs, and they unfortunately were knocked out, losing 4-3 on aggregate. Doumbia and Ahmed Musa, both future Premier League players, scored crucial goals that eliminated Sporting from Europe's competition. Despite that early European setback, Bruno was aiming for the biggest domestic prize, the league title, and Sporting got off to a flying start. They went unbeaten in their first 13 matches, winning 11 and drawing 2, including a stunning 3-0 victory over Benfica at the Estadio da Luz. All 3 goals came in the first half, scored by Teo Gutierrez, Brian Ruiz and Islam Slimani. By mid-December, Sporting were leading the league by 2 points ahead of Porto and 7 points ahead of Benfica. But that's not all. Bruno worked his magic off the field. In 2015, he signed a mega money deal with TV providers NOS. The agreement was officially announced on December 29, 2015, and it was a landmark deal for Sporting, worth over €515 million over 10 years. It included exclusive broadcasting rights with Sporting's home league matches, sponsorship and advertising rights. Sporting would gain a sponsor on the front of their shirts with NOS, and also the rights to Sporting TV, the club's official channel that was again launched by Bruno de Carvalho. At the time, it was the most lucrative deal in Sporting's history, and a major financial achievement under Bruno de Carvalho's presidency. However, on the field, then came a shock 1-0 result to União de Madeira, losing to a newly promoted side. Sporting bounced back impressively though, winning their next 3 matches, beating Porto 2-0, Setúbal 6-0 and Braga 3-2, putting them 4 points clear at the top, with Benfica and Porto level behind them on 40 points. However, this is when the cracks started to show. Sporting drew 3 of their next 7 games against Tondela, Rio Ave and Vitória Guimarães. After the draw with Guimarães, captain William Carvalho tried to reassure fans by saying, "We're still in first." Technically, true, but the lead had dwindled just to a single point. Meanwhile, Benfica were surging. Since their 3-0 loss to Sporting, they hadn't dropped a single point until a defeat to Porto on February 12th. Then came a match that would define the title race, Sporting versus Benfica at the Alvalade. Mitroglou would score early for Benfica in the 20th minute to give Benfica the lead. Later, Brian Ruiz had a golden opportunity to equalise. An open goal, surely he's got to score, but unfortunately he blasted it over the bar. This miss proved costly, as Benfica held on to win the game 1-0, leapfrogging Sporting in first place. Neither team lost a league match after that, and Sporting finished the season in spectacular form, including a 3-1 win over Porto and a 4-0 demolition of Braga. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Benfica claimed the title with 88 points, while Sporting finished just behind on an impressive 86. To make matters worse, Benfica also won the Taça da Liga, while Sporting ended the season without any additional silverware. Benfica made it to Champions League quarter-finals, narrowly losing 3-2 on aggregate to Bayern Munich, while Sporting exited the Europa League in the round of 32. This would not be the final blow to Bruno de Carvalho. You see, Andre Carrillo, the Peruvian winger who was one of Sporting's best players, was in the last year of his contract. But Sporting rejected a move and a bid from Leicester for the winger. The winger was not happy and demanded he'd be sold or that he would leave at the end of the season. Bruno de Carvalho was faced with an ultimatum: either be blackmailed by the player and his agent or take a stand. And as we all know, Bruno de Carvalho would take the second option. He would not allow Jorge Jesus to pick Andre Carrillo and force him to train with the reserves for the whole season, not playing a single game since the Supertaça. But how did Andre Carrillo respond? Did he finally get his move to Leicester? No. Instead, he went across to the crosstown rivals Benfica and signed with them as a free agent. However, there was some good news from that season. Sporting had finished second, which in this season meant they'd be directly qualified into the Champions League, giving them Champions League money. And in 2016-17, they splashed the cash, bringing in Bas Dost, someone who scored against them a few years ago if you remember, for a club record fee of 11.85 million euros, Alan Ruiz, the Red Ferrari man, for 4 million euros, Coates was made permanent for 4.72 million euros. Weirdly, he brought back a player called Elias, the previous club record signing, who left just a few years ago, where he called Bruno de Carvalho a quote, crazy man when he left in 2013. On his return, he would say, yeah, he is crazy. Crazy about Sporting. Nice save, Elias. He would also bring in some big name players. Beto would come in for free from Sevilla, Joel Campbell would come on loan from Arsenal, and in another blow to Benfica, Lazar Markovic would come on loan from Liverpool, spending 34 million in total. Chico Giraldes, João Palhinha and Daniel Podence would all be promoted from the B team. But on the outs, Bruno de Carvalho would make some record sales, selling João Mario to Inter Milan for 44 million euros, then the highest fee for a Sporting player. He would also, that same window, sell Islam Slimani for 31 million euros to Leicester. And with some other sales like Naldo, Tanaka and Joao Pereira, as well as some loan fees for players like Carlos Mane, Teo Gutierrez and Everton, they would make over 18 million euros in player sales, the highest ever up to this point. Unfortunately, this was not the Sporting from last season. In fact, the squad had such a high turnover of starters, including basically a whole new defence and players low on confidence, especially Brian Ruiz, who ever since that miss looked a shell of his former self. Despite beating Porto in the third game of the season, by February, Sporting had lost 3 games to Rio Ave, Benfica and Braga, and drew 5 to Vitória Guimarães, Tondela, Nacional, in back-to-back games nonetheless, and Chaves and Maritimo. Things would not get any better in the UCL, as they were drawn against Dortmund, Real Madrid and Legia Warsaw. Despite taking the lead against Madrid, Sporting would lose 2-1, thanks to 2 goals in 5 minutes from Real Madrid, from the 89th from former player Ronaldo and a 94th minute winner from Morata. They would only win 1 game and lose the rest, beating Legia at home 2-0 but finishing dead last in the group, knocking them out of Europe completely. They had also been knocked out of the Taça de Portugal by January, losing 1-0 to Chaves. Bruno de Carvalho would once again make a controversial move. In the Taça da Liga, all Sporting had to do was draw to Vitória Setúbal and they would be through to the next round. Unfortunately, they would lose 2-1 due to a 94th minute penalty in which, to be fair, was a dubious call. How did Bruno de Carvalho respond? He took 2 players who were on loan at Vitória Setúbal, Andre Giraldes and Ryan Gould, and terminated their loan contracts with Setúbal. This was especially harmful to young Gould, who had impressed in the 10 games he had had for Setúbal up to that point. And it did feel like, at the time, Bruno harmed the player's career just to get a one-up on Setúbal. At Sporting, those Bruno had made some more drastic decisions, including already selling Elias and Andre, who had only just bought 4 months ago, and ending the loan of Lazar Markovic early after just scoring 1 goal, where he would join Hull City and link up with former Sporting manager Marco Silva. That season he was also allegedly accused of spitting his vape fluid at Arroca's president after a disagreement after the game. although during the post-game press conference, no one mentioned the incident. Only a week later, when a video was leaked, did the Aroca president accuse Bruno de Carvalho of doing something. Sporting would finish that season trophyless, in 3rd place and 6 points behind Porto and 12 behind Benfica, who had just won their 4th title in a row. There were calls for Jorge Jesus to be sacked, especially due to the 5 million per year salary he was on, and the fact that Marco Silva had won the same amount of silverware up to that point. But Bruno kept his faith in Jesus and would throw one last roll of the dice. The 17-18 season, the last roll of the dice for Bruno de Carvalho under Jorge Jesus. A huge investment which as of yet hadn't paid off. One last attempt to win something they hadn't won in nearly 20 years, the Liga Portugal title. But off the pitch, it was Bruno who would continue to make Sporting a global sports project. First up, he inaugurated the Pavilhão João Rocha, which is Sporting's long-awaited multi-sport arena. It was integrated on June 21st, 2017, also my birthday, during Bruno de Carvalho's presidency. By the way, my birthday not being in 2017, I'm obviously quite old. The João Rocha hosts sports like handball, futsal, basketball, volleyball and many others, all which have seen major investment and titles under Bruno de Carvalho's presidency. You see, Sporting weren't just a football club, they were a club of many sports and have very major successes in futsal, handball, basketball and many more. Bruno de Carvalho considered the completion of the João Rocha Pavilion one of his proudest achievements, a symbol of restoring Sporting's multi-club sports spirit. Many Sporting fans saw it as a revival of the club's identity beyond just football. Speaking of football, in 2017-18, Liga Portugal would be the first of a revolution. That would be Liga Portugal, formerly known as Liga NOS, introducing VAR at the start of the 2017-18 season following tests in the Taça de Portugal and friendlies. This was huge for Sporting, but most especially Bruno de Carvalho, who at the time had been a massive part of this coming to Portugal. As early as 2014, Bruno de Carvalho advocated for VAR, and at the time they called him crazy for wanting to take the magic and passion away of football. You could argue that it was due to his arguments with Benfica and Luis Felipe Vieira being corrupt, but whatever the motive was, bringing VAR to Portugal was a huge step in the right direction and something that needed to happen for transparency. But back to football. Bruno had invested big. In came Bruno Fernandes, Marcos Acuna, Wendell, Rodrigo Battaglia, Seydou Doumbia, Fabio Coentrão and Jeremy Mathieu. Even Fredy Montero would return to the club he left just 18 months ago. Sporting would spend a record 47 million euros, but it is on the outs where the first bit of controversy happened this season. You see, Sporting captain Adrien Silva arguably had his 2 best years at Sporting in the 2 seasons previous. He'd been called up to the national team, been a part of the squad that won the Euro 2016, and by the 2015-16 season, he was firmly established as one of the senior leaders, and he was the captain of Sporting. Although rumours had come in about his departure in years previous to clubs like Spurs and West Brom, there was no deal that was ever struck. But on the final game before deadline day, Adrien Silva would do a flash interview after the game, and he confirmed that he was leaving the club. The only problem? Bruno de Carvalho and Jorge Jesus had absolutely no knowledge of this. They had not even seen a transfer offer or known of Adrien Silva's wish to depart. Sporting and Bruno de Carvalho would make a statement saying Adrien renewed his contract in February 2016, committing to stay to the end of his career. This intention was clearly stated to him, his father and his agents before signing. In May 2016, Adrien said he didn't plan to leave the club without winning the league title. Sporting has not received any transfer offers for Adrien, nor have his agents ever presented one. If Adrien was misled, it was not by the club's board or the president. Adrien remains under contract and is expected to respect the club and its supporters. Sporting also reaffirmed its commitment to supporting and protecting his players, as Bruno would go on to say, and he would plead to the fans not to turn on Adrien as he was not at fault for the actions of his agent. But what happened next is nothing less than crazy. Leicester would submit a bid of 22 million euros for Adrien on deadline day, whilst Adrian was on international duty with Portugal. Adrian quickly had to leave the camp to go for his medicals in England, but for financial reasons they had to wait to sell Danny Drinkwater to Chelsea before they could put through the paperwork. On August 31st, 2017, transfer deadline day, Leicester submitted the paperwork to FIFA just seconds after the deadline. Reports later confirmed that the documents were submitted 14 seconds late, enough for FIFA to reject the transfer. Bruno de Carvalho was criticised by some fans and media outlets for his role in Adrian Silva's transfer saga, but the main blame fell on Leicester for their poor planning. Bruno de Carvalho was known for being tough in his negotiations, especially with foreign clubs. Some believed he delayed sending key documents or pushed negotiations too close to the deadline to maximise Sporting's gain. There was speculation that Sporting didn't release Adrian's international transfer certificate, known as an ITC, in time, but that was never fully confirmed by Adrian, Leicester or Sporting. Despite the criticism, Sporting maintained they did everything on their end properly and on time. Adrian was devastated by the delay. He later expressed frustration with how both clubs handled the situation. He didn't openly blame Sporting, Bruno de Carvalho or Leicester, but he was clearly hurt about how things unfolded. Sporting and Leicester had signed everything needed for the transfer on their end, in terms of contract, agreements and fees. Once both clubs signed and submitted the documents, Adrian was no longer registered with Sporting domestically, even if FIFA hadn't approved his registration for Leicester. FIFA rules also state that a club cannot cancel a transfer retroactively after the transfer window closes and the registration has been attempted. Adrian's career would never be the same. He would spend a few years in France and Italy, but currently his last club was in the second division of Dubai. In terms of other outs, Ruben Semedo also had a harsh send-off. When rumours announced that he could be leaving, Sporting fans were thrilled that he was going, especially after a poor 16-17 season. So much so, they even held up a banner saying, "Ruben Semedo, bon voyage." But don't feel bad for him though. Later that season, he was arrested for kidnapping, and has later been arrested for sexual assault. Elsewhere, Paulo Oliveira, Charlotto, Zegler and Teo Gutierrez were all sold, bringing in €49 million for the club. Also, Jefferson and Ricardo Esgaio both headed out to SC Braga, on loan and free respectively. Things started off on fire for Sporting. They won their first 6 games in the league, including a 5-0 hammering away at Vitória Guimarães, and Sporting sat in second place, only 1 goal behind Porto on goal difference, both with 18 points, and Benfica sat in 4th with 13. This season was important, as this year 3rd place would not go into Champions League qualifying, they would go directly into the Europa League, so only 1st and 2nd really had the big prize. In the Champions League, Sporting were dealt another tough group. Sporting had qualified to the Champions League after beating Bucharest 5-1 on aggregate, but had Barcelona, Juventus and Olympiacos waiting for them in the group stage. But Sporting actually got off to a winning start, beating Olympiacos 3-2 away, although they were 3-0 up until the 89th minute, but 2 consecutive losses to Barca at home and Juventus away, despite leading against the Italian side from the 12th minute, followed. They would however get a huge result at home, drawing to Juventus and then beating Olympiacos 3-1. They could still qualify to the round of 16, but after Barcelona beat them 2-0 and Juventus beat Olympiacos, Sporting would finish in a respectable 3rd place, sending them into the Europa League. Elsewhere in the Taça da Liga, Sporting would go on a tear, topping their group, including beating União de Madeira 6-0. They would also beat Porto in the semi-finals on penalties, and then again on penalties would beat Vitória Setúbal in the final, winning only Georgie's 2nd trophy with Sporting. But this was seen as a success, as Sporting was still doing very well domestically, and people thought they could actually go all the way and win the treble that year. And it wasn't that far-fetched to think so. They had a very good squad, of course they had a good manager, but they also had great performances in Europe. It wasn't that far-fetched to think Sporting could have won the title that year. Meanwhile, around this time, January to be exact in the league, Sporting was still unbeaten. However, they did draw 5 games, first to Moreirense, then Porto, then Braga, then Benfica and Setúbal. But there was no reason to panic. They were still only 2 points behind FC Porto and 4 in front of Benfica. But there was reason to panic when Sporting lost their first game of the season 2-0 away to Estoril, because now Porto were on 58 points and Sporting and Benfica were both on 53, but Sporting being ahead on away goals. You see, when Sporting and Benfica played, they drew 1-1. But due to the Portuguese league rules, the person who scores an away goal against the other team actually goes higher in the league. It's not set to goal difference until that is equal. For example, if Sporting scored at the Luz and then Benfica scored at the Alvalade, then it would go to goal difference. Elsewhere in Europe, Sporting would compete in the Europa League, beating Astana 6-4 on aggregate, making it to the round of 16, where they luckily scraped by Victoria Pleasant, beating them 3-2 on aggregate thanks to an extra time goal from Rodrigo Battaglia in the 105th minute. They were dealt a massive blow in the quarter-finals though, being drawn against Atletico Madrid, who were in the UCL final just 2 seasons ago. In the league, unfortunately, things were getting worse for Sporting. They would lose 2-1 to Porto. This made even stupider as the game before, Sporting beat Moreirense in the last minute of the game, with Gelson Martins scoring the winner. But remember Ruben Semedo? He had just been arrested for kidnapping, as mentioned earlier, and as a show of support, his good friend Gelson Martins took his shirt off, with a message of support to the centre-back. The problem? He was already on a yellow card. The referee had no choice but to give him the second yellow and send him off. This meant that he was suspended for the game against FC Porto. And despite Rafael Leao scoring on his debut, Sporting were beat 2-1 and lost 1-0 to Braga. It was now on to the Europa League and the first leg against Atletico Madrid. Sporting were away from home in the first match and they would lose 2-0, which I would say Sporting still competed pretty well and was somewhat a respectable result. To some, not to Bruno de Carvalho. Strap yourselves in, ladies and gentlemen, this is where it gets tasty. Bruno de Carvalho would take to Facebook right after Sporting's first leg loss to Atletico Madrid in the Europa League, in April 2018 when he publicly lashed out his players. The key points he raised were Coates and Mathieu for their mistakes, Gelson Martins failing to take his chance when clean through, and Fabio Coentrão and Bas Dost for collecting yellow cards which deliberately, in his eyes, ruled them out of the second leg. Back in Lisbon, the atmosphere among the squad was evidently tense. Although the club denied the rumours that the first team had refused to train, later that afternoon, 18 senior players shared a post on Instagram expressing their disapproval of the public criticism and the absence of support from someone who should be their leader. Among the group who posted the message were practically all of Sporting's most important players, such as captains Rui Patricio and William Carvalho, fellow internationals Fabio Coentrão and Bruno Fernandes, as well as Gelson Martins, and experienced players such as Brian Ruiz, Coates and Montero. The only 2 players not to post a message were Bas Dost and Petrovic, as both of them did not have social media at that time, but were still in support of the squad. The post read, quote, "We will always fight for our club, for our supporters and for ourselves. For this reason, we express in this message our displeasure at the public comments of our president after a game in which we did not get the result we wanted. Also due to the lack of support from the one who's supposed to be our leader. No matter what the situation, all such matters should be resolved within the group." This is where it gets ugly. Bruno de Carvalho announced on Facebook that he would suspend nearly the entire first team squad following a spat between himself and the players, saying, quote, "All the players who wrote the message below are suspended with immediate effect and will face the club's disciplinary procedures. This time my patience has run out for those who think they're above the club and are immune to any sort of criticism." A press conference was supposed to be held before the game against Paços de Ferreira, but unfortunately it was postponed for 3 hours, amid reports that Sporting would field a reserve team in the league match against Paços de Ferreira. However, Jorge Jesus was in full support of the players and had no intention of using B team players in the league, and he went to Bruno de Carvalho and said he would resign if it happened. Bruno would meet with the Sporting players on April 7th, with Jorge Jesus acting as the intermediator a day before the Paços de Ferreira game. Allegedly, there was no apology issued by either side, but the suspension was lifted. But before the game, Bruno de Carvalho again would return to Facebook, confirming that disciplinary proceedings against his players for, quote, "tarnishing the good name of the president and the club" will be maintained, but that suspending them wasn't a suitable punishment. The full quote reads, quote, "The president," that's how Bruno de Carvalho refers to himself, "came to the conclusion that the suspension imposed on the players would not have any punishment effect, but only serve as an excuse for them not to fulfill their duties and their paid obligations. The president does and acts how he wants and as he wants. The only thing that drives him and always will drive him is the protection of the superior interests of sporting, and to honour those trust in the members that elected him. At the meeting, two things became clear: the manager's loyalty to the president, and the players who were in charge of the whole rebellion were players for years that have demanded to lead the club. This is particularly interesting because the only players who had been at Sporting for years, or 2 or more years at this point, were Rui Patricio, William Carvalho, Gelson Martins, Coates and Brian Ruiz, throwing his captains and key players under the bus hours before kickoff. Sporting would beat Pacos de Ferreira 2-0 in a very emotional game. The players and the managers were applauded, Jorge Jesus even cried, and Bruno de Carvalho was whistled and verbally abused, in which he randomly claimed a back injury, even getting Sporting to release the picture on their social media accounts of him getting treatment. Jorge Jesus would say, quote, "It hasn't been easy. I've been through a lot, but never something like this. I had to realise I had to defend the club. That's what I did. I will always have my players' side." Bruno de Carvalho would say after the game, quote, "The abuse is unacceptable, but people are free to express themselves and be ungrateful if they wish. Ingratitude and foolishness is like music to me. I will not resign as Sporting president." End quote. Just a few days later, Sporting would post an official statement. Although a unanimous Sporting board found the players' attitude incorrect, Sporting have in a statement officially withdrawn all the disciplinary processes against their players for the rebellion against President Bruno de Carvalho. Surprisingly, they would actually beat Atletico Madrid in the second leg, but only by 1-0, meaning Atletico would go through. But it was still a good result considering the circumstances. They would also have a great run in the Taça de Portugal, winning every game until the semi-finals, where they lost the first leg to Porto 1-0. But in the second leg, they would beat Porto 1-0, meaning it would go to penalties. And once again, Sporting would beat them to advance to the final. The next few league games were uneventful. Sporting would beat Belenenses, Boavista and Portimonense. But unfortunately, by matchday 32, FC Porto were already crowned champions. This was due to Benfica losing 3-2 to Tondela at home. But it also meant good news for Sporting, who were level on points now with Benfica. And guess who the penultimate game of the season was against? That's right, it was against Benfica. All Sporting had to do was win. Due to head-to-head, they would finish second outright and be put in Champions League qualifying. Just to put that in perspective, because you might not think it's a big deal between second and third, the financial difference between second UCL and third Europa League for Sporting was 27 million euros compared to 3 million euros. But more importantly, Sporting were at home. But unfortunately, it was a nothing game. A boring 0-0, which meant it would all go down to play for in the final day. But it was still good news for Sporting. You see, they were still ahead on goals scored as mentioned before, so if the points stayed the same, Sporting would finish second. Sporting had to go face Marítimo away and Benfica would face Moreirense. Benfica would have to win and would hope Sporting would lose or draw. Marítimo, unfortunately for Sporting, would take the lead through Joel Tagel. But just 1 minute later, Bastos would equalise, and at half time it was 1-1. For Benfica, they would be 0-0 at half time, but would score thanks to the Jonas penalty in the 55th minute. Despite dominating the game, Sporting would only have 3 shots on target out of 10. In the 91st minute, a desperate strike from Gazarian would roll to Rui Patricio at slow speed, but unfortunately Rui Patricio was torn between catching it and parrying it, ultimately completely misjudging the ball, and it ended up in the Sporting net. Final score 2 to Marítimo, 1 Sporting, and Benfica 1, Moreirense 0. Jorge Jesus was shocked. Rui Patricio was in tears. But most importantly, the fans were furious. They would hold up a banner to say "attitude here," basically accusing the Sporting players of not having the right attitude to play for the club. Tensions rose from there, as at the airport in Madeira, some players had a heated verbal exchange with the ultras at Madeira airport, with security having to drag fans away, whilst Acuna arguably got the most given to him, but also gave the most back. It seemed like a nothing incident, That is until they got back to Lisbon and even more fans verbally abused and whistled the players and the manager. As captains and prime suspects behind Sporting squad revolt against President Bruno de Carvalho, Rui Patricio and William Carvalho were at the centre of criticism, insults and attacks. But unfortunately, as time went on, this was clearly not an isolated incident. Just a few days after Sporting missed out on next season's Champions League, and 5 days before they played in the Portugal Cup final, 60 so-called fans invaded the training centre and physically attacked players and technical staff. While manager Jorge Jesus was the first to be attacked, the fans left Sporting top scorer Bas Dost with visible wounds to his head and foot. The staff didn't manage to prevent the 60 masked men from entering Sporting's locker room, where they attacked Freddie Montero, William Carvalho, Marcos Acuna and Mistic with belts, sticks and punches. In this video from Sporting's dressing room after the hooligan attack, you can hear Bruno Fernandes say to his teammates, "It's been a pleasure playing with you all." Make of that what you will. After the incident, 23 hooligans were detained after the attacks and charged with several crimes, including kidnapping, forest fires and terrorism. But this did not represent all Sporting fans, as more than 500 Sporting fans gathered outside the stadium on the night of the attack to display their disgust with the attack and also show support to the players, most notably Bas Dost, which they sung his song outside the stadium. A few days later, the Sporting players would announce via Instagram and issue a statement confirming their presence on the Taça da Liga final for that Sunday. Quote, "Our respect for my colleagues, Aves and the good name of Portugal." End quote. Sporting president would also be asked about the attack shortly after it happened, and he would say, quote, "It was annoying, but tomorrow is a new day. We have to realise that crime is a part of everyday life and has to be punished in the right place." End quote. Soon after this, Bruno de Carvalho was asked to resign by the Sporting board, as they deemed him responsible for the toxic nature of the club. As a response, Bruno de Carvalho came out swinging, verbally of course, on another statement, reading, quote, "The press tried and achieved to manipulate what I said, dishonouring an honoured man. The club is being bullied and terrorised by press, politicians and renowned Sporting members." This is just a small transcript of Bruno de Carvalho's 1.5 hour long run, and it is quite sensational. In this statement, although he stressed that players weren't at fault, he indirectly gives them, and especially Rui Patricio, responsibility for being attacked by its own fans. But the season wasn't over. Sporting still had to play Aves in what should have been an easy game, due to Aves being near bottom of the table. Bas Dost would play with a bandage on his head and still had visible scars to his head and body. But with everything that went on, unfortunately Sporting lost 2-1 in the final, with again arguably Rui Patricio being at fault for both goals, and even Bas Dost missing an open goal. Patricio was in tears after a horrible week, which is summed up by losing to Maritimo and losing out on next season's Champions League. Tuesday, attacked by 50 masked men at their own training complex, leaving several players physically and mentally scarred. Sunday, they lost the Portuguese Cup final to Aves. Sporting manager Jorge Jesus would say, quote, "It's been a very complicated week, starting with what looked like a horror movie. I want to thank my players for their professionalism of even playing the final." End quote. Sporting would later announce they'd cut all benefits given to Ultra Group Juve while they were under investigation for the attack on Sporting staff and players. Sporting also announced they'll heavily increase security for the training complex. But the story doesn't end there, ladies and gentlemen. Rui Patricio had an exit in sight. After a horrible season, it made sense why he wanted to leave. Sporting had agreed a deal with Wolves to sell Patricio for €18 million. But at the last second, Bruno de Carvalho stopped the deal, saying, quote, "Of the €18 million, Jorge Mendes wanted €7 million of them. My doors will always be open for talks. Business, yes, but not blackmail. I don't think Rui Patricio wants to bring that upon the club that helped him grow so much." How did Rui Patricio respond? Well, he terminated his contract with Sporting, citing, quote, the assault on my professionalism and personal dignity, having also put in question my security and physical safety, making me fear for my life. What followed was a mass exodus. Daniel Podence, William Carvalho, Gelson Martins, Bruno Fernandes, Bas Dost, Marcos Acuna, Rodrigo Battaglia, Ruben Ribeiro and Rafael Leao all terminated their contracts. Bruno Fernandes would say, quote, "On the eve of the cup final, instead of trying to cheer his players up, he decided to talk about himself, acting like he was the victim and blaming the players for what happened at the training complex." This would get even juicier if you were a Benfica fan or a neutral, as Benfica president at the time, Luis Felipe Vieira, was quoted with saying, "This year I'm going to do something crazy," and confirmed that he'll try to sign the Sporting players that ended their deals. He allegedly had dinner with Gelson Martins' agents a few days later and also wanted to sign Bruno Fernandes. Bas Dost would say in his termination letter, quote, "2 days after the fans' attack, I had to go see a psychologist because I just couldn't sleep. I was in a state of great anxiety and irritation. I was diagnosed with some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. I had great headaches for several days." Jorge Jesus would also leave Sporting by mutual consent, joining Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia. Sporting would hire Serbian manager Sinza Mihajlovic as their new boss to replace Jorge Jesus. But not so fast. On the 25th of June 2018, Sporting members had voted at a General Assembly to expel Bruno de Carvalho as president and socio. 71% of almost 15,000 members who were present voted for the dismissal of Bruno de Carvalho and the rest of his board. Just hours after being dismissed, Bruno de Carvalho claimed he would no longer be a Sporting fan and that his 5 years at the club had been a waste. But just a few minutes after, Bruno de Carvalho had made a complete turnaround, claiming that he was still president and that he'll contest the votes and run for re-election. A week after signing a 3-year deal with Sporting, Sinja Mihajlovic would get the axe following the recent dismissal of President Bruno de Carvalho, who would sign the Serbian manager, but Mihajlovic would later successfully sue Sporting in court for wrongful termination. Sousa Sintra would become the interim president of Sporting, and whilst he was there, he re-signed Bas Dost, Battaglia, Acuna and Bruno Fernandes, whilst allegedly some of the players had an anti-Bruno clause that if Bruno de Carvalho would come back in any manner that they could resign their contracts without paying a penny. Sousa Sintra also reportedly gave Bas Dost €100,000 per week, and the other, Battaglia and Acuna, also getting big pay rises. The only one that didn't get a pay rise allegedly was Bruno Fernandes, who just wanted to be the club captain. On September 8th, Sporting would have a new president, the head of the medical team during Bruno de Carvalho's tenure, Frederico Varandas. And what happened to Bruno de Carvalho? He has since appeared on Celebrity Big Brother in Portugal, became a DJ and married a famous pop star. I also got to interview Bruno de Carvalho for my Sporting podcast, All Things Out Loud, as you can see by this clip here.
When you are a mediocre people, when you don't have the knowledge, but you want to have the power, you need to rule in a world of mediocre people.
I would strongly recommend you go listen to it, and that isn't a plug, but you can just get an insight to how the man was and how he speaks and how he comes across. To be honest, from a personal perspective, I always liked Bruno de Carvalho. Even towards the end, I feel like he was harshly treated. He was very outspoken, don't get me wrong, and he made mistakes, but I also think he wasn't responsible. And to add to this, he was successfully acquitted of all wrongdoing, after initially being arrested for having a hand in the Alcochete attacks, but he was later found innocent by the courts and the judge. So, in my opinion, Bruno de Carvalho was definitely a controversial figure, but is someone who I think I respect in terms of how he managed to turn the club around, because he did. He did make mistakes which led to the undoing, but I don't think you can blame him for the attack. He did create maybe a toxic atmosphere, in which I do agree, but at the same time, he did save Sporting from the brink of bankruptcy. He signed that lucrative deal with NOS, he inaugurated the João Rocha Pavilion, and also was a part of so many things for Sporting that was such, good things in growing their brand, such as the modalities in futsal and basketball and all this stuff. So I do think he did save Sporting in a way. I do think he left at the right time. even though he didn't left, he got expelled. I think it was probably the right time for him to go. I don't think there was any way back for him, unfortunately. But I think, in my personal opinion, I know he is a controversial figure, and I know a lot of Sporting fans don't like him. I know some of them do. I see both sides. Me personally, I do like Bruno de Carvalho, but I think he reached his limit and reached his end at the right time. I think if he would have stayed, I think Sporting probably would have got even worse. Sporting arguably don't get that 70 million they made for Bruno Fernandes, and they arguably don't get Ruben Amorim and get to rebuild. But if you want to know what happened to Frederico Varandas and his time at Sporting, make sure you check out this video on screen right now. It is a timeline of how Ruben Amorim saved the club, but also how Frederico Varandas came in and saved the club as well, because he is the one who appointed Ruben Amorim and Hugo Viana. So definitely make sure you check that out. What are your thoughts on Alcochete? Do you think Bruno de Carvalho was at fault? Do you think this whole thing could have been avoided? If this is your first time hearing about Bruno de Carvalho, what do you think of him? Anyway, I'm Mr. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time, man. Peace.